Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Stavros Papadopoulos from the Australian Archaeological Institute at Athens, and it is the privilege of welcoming you to MAARC 2023's keynote lecture, and introducing our speaker falls to me this morning. Our lecturer today, as you will all know, is John Papadopoulos, who holds the position of Distinguished Professor of Archaeology and Classics at the University of California, Los Angeles. And I will also add that John is an alumnus of the University of Sydney. His research and teaching interests are very broad, and they include the Aegean, of course, as well as the Eastern and Central Mediterranean, from the late Bronze Age and through into the early Iron Age and beyond to the classical and later periods. Indeed, it will be difficult to find a period within that range on which John has not published. But his interests also can be further refined into the archaeology of colonization, of death, topography and architecture of Athens, and an array of other topics. Our speaker is an accomplished excavator, and he's excavated and conducted fieldwork in Greece, Albania, Italy, and Australia, as well as having directed the important repatriation project of material from Francavilla Marittima in southern Italy. He is, as I'm sure all of you know, a very prodigious author, and he's authored and edited 13 books. And in a discussion earlier, he informed me that a volume related to the topic of this morning's lecture will come out very shortly. So there will be another one to add to the list. And of course, he's published a myriad of articles and book reviews. More recently, mid last year in 2020, he was appointed and took up the position of the director of the excavations at the Athenian Agora, one of the sites which he spent many years working on and which he knows like very few other people do. Today, though, John will be taking us to the northern Aegean in his presentation, The Ancient Methoni Archaeological Project. And I'm sure that all of you are as eagerly awaiting to hear the presentation as I am. So John, please.
Thank you, Stavro. Thank you very much for that gracious introduction. It's just wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues whom I haven't seen in the flesh for a long time. I haven't been in Australia. We were actually going to be on a plane in March of 2020, and when we woke up that morning, we basically had to cancel our flight, so we haven't been back to Oz for a while. It's great to be invited to be part of this Mediterranean Archaeology Australasian research community and to give this lecture on our work at Ancient Methoni. And what I'll be primarily talking about is, the field work that we did between 2014 and 2017. And I'm just one of several co-directors of this project. So I'm really representing all of my colleagues, Manthos Besios, Sarah Morris, Athina Thanasiadou, Konstantinos Noulas, and also a call out to the entire Methoni team. Now, unlike most people, I actually like to thank the funding bodies and all the people that took part in the project up front, not at the end. This is where they deserve to be. So there's a whole slew of them. Like every good archaeological project. So you can see the area out in the green on the map on the left, and it's one of the most stunning coastlines anywhere in the Aegean. It's a very beautiful place. Thanks to the work of Bruno Helly and more recently of Sarah, it turns out that this may very well be the kingdom of Philoctetes. So the Mycenaean, the northern border of the Mycenaean homeland does not stop in Thessaly. It actually extends further north. We hear about the kingdom of Philoctetes in the Iliad, Book 2, 716 to 719. And also, we hear about Agamemnon's curse, and it's a memory that's actually preserved in a fragment of Strabo that talks about Agamemnon coming to this Methone, asking for timber to repair his ships before going to Troy, and the Methonians tell him no. So he curses it. And the curse was, may your fortification walls keep collapsing. And that's exactly what happened. It was like the curse of Atreus all over again. So this is a view, an aerial view. It's Hugh Thomas's wonderful picture. This is the West Hill excavations. This is the area that we were digging. You can also see the East Hill excavation. And what I wanted to point out was all this land that you see in the background is recent silting because of the rivers. It's the confluence of the Aliakmon, the Axios, the Lothias, these three massive rivers. The Aliakmon is actually the longest single river that runs in Greece. It's just shy of 300 kilometers, beginning in Epirus. So here's a map that locates, this is what the topography would have looked like in the classical period with the lake near Pella, gave Pella in the Macedonian kingdom its access to the sea. We've done a more recent map showing what this would have looked like. You can see here. There's also the city of Alaros seems to have been always on an island or in a hill that was in the middle of this otherwise open sea or swampy ground. Now, if you look at the Aster 30-meter topography, this is actually, the light green is actually what the original Thermaic Gulf was. The white is what the Thermaic Gulf is like today. So you can see the Axios, the Gallikos River, Lothias, and of course the Aliakmon. And Methone is right at the delta of the Aliakmon River. And here's an older Aster 30 map that shows the same thing. It was here in 354 BC where Philip II, the father of Alexander, lost his right eye. And yes, we were trying to find it without any success. In order to ensure active defense of their city, but also to bring in much needed supplies, the Methonians actually dug a series of tunnels that went under their fortifications in order that they could go out and fight Philip's army. And these are two of the 4 tunnels that have been uncovered to date at ancient Methone. There were hundreds of lead sling bullets that were part of the siege of 354 and thousands of bronze and iron arrowheads. We also have a bolt like this, and this one is inscribed with the name of Philip. You can see it in the drawing and in the photograph. And we also know on the testimony of Diodorus Siculus and again also Strabo that the Methonian who actually took out Philip's right eye was one individual called Aster or Asteros. And according to the testimony of Diodorus Siculus and of Strabo, Philip's response was, "If I catch you, Asteros, I will hang you." Now, in order to assist their longtime allies, the ancient Athenians in their Second Empire period sent 3,000 heavily armed soldiers to their old ally. And this is an alliance that goes back into the 5th century. And we actually have this celebrated tree that was originally on the Athenian Acropolis. It's in the new Acropolis Museum. It had fallen and was found in the Theatre of Dionysus in Athens. And it's a series of treaties between Athens and Methone dating between 430, 429, and 424, 423 BC. And there would have been a second one of these that was set up somewhere at Methone, which hasn't been found to date. So what I've marked out here in red is the extent of the ancient city of Methone, the prehistoric city that goes through the early Iron Age into the classical period and is destroyed by Philip II in 354 BC. And in order that Methone is never again resettled, what Philip does is he sets up a garrison, a Macedonian garrison here in blue. I've marked it out in blue in what we refer to as Macedonia, Methone. And this is just shy of a kilometer to the northwest. So this is the topography. You can see the Agora, which is on the East Hill. And originally, this is a very dynamic landscape, okay? So originally, these would have been not so much hills, but promontories that jutted out into the Thermaic Gulf. On the right, the West Hill, the so-called Acropolis, this is the area that we focused on in our own excavations. So here is the Agora, and it's marked by this incredible early Stoa building. The original Stoa building goes back to the second quarter of the 6th century BC. So it's one of the earliest. So this is the Stoa that you see etched out in red on the right. And there's another building, building B here, which was given over through the production of metal, particularly of iron. And there's a big open square, which is the Agora here. This was excavated by our Greek colleagues, headed by Manthos Besios, back in the years between 2003 and 2011. And so here is the Stoa. I actually uncovered it again to get new photography and to get drone photography and to include it also in our LiDAR survey. And this is a photogrammatic plan of this area that was made in 2014 by Hugh Thomas and Mike Rocchio. Samantha Martin was the person who looked at the architecture of this building. And it's the only masonry. Stone is very rare in this part of Greece. So Pieria doesn't have any good marble or any good limestone. And so most of the buildings are stone sockles with a mud brick superstructure. And you can actually see the well-preserved mud brick on this wall of the Stoa building. And here is part of a collapsed mud brick wall. So it's almost like digging in the ancient Near East, digging these, substantial levels of disintegrated mud brick. So here is a plan of the Stoa. What's etched out in pink here, in reddish pink by Samantha Martin, is actually the original building, which was built in the second quarter of the 6th century BC. The green represents last quarter of the 6th, and the porch, the Stoa portico, was built in the earlier part of the 5th century BC. And this was a building that it appears that during the siege of 354 BC, the Athenians, or some of them at least, had bivouacked in. So one of the most exciting things that was found in this agora area was the so-called Iboion, this huge basement that I'll show you in a minute. There are also a series of prehistoric features, labeled trenches on this plan. One is late Neolithic. The other one, etched out in blue, is final Neolithic and early Bronze Age. And what these prehistoric ditches actually show is that the East Hill was originally much larger, jutted out into the sea further to the east and north, and that these ditches actually go and terminate into what is now thin air. So there was substantial collapse of this promontory, both into the Thermaid Gulf and also over the lower agora area. But the thing that was really the most spectacular discovery of the early excavations by Manthos Basios and our colleagues was really this second Iboion, this basement. And here it is with human scale to give you an idea of its scale. It was a massive undertaking, and the stratigraphy. It was at least 11 meters deep, and it was perhaps originally 14 meters deep if we add the collapse of the East Hill. And collectively, phases 1 to 3, which were filled up in a very short period of time, we're probably only talking about days or weeks, date to a very short period at the end of the 8th and into the early 7th century BC. And one of the most spectacular discoveries within this corpus of early material was just under 30 alphabetic inscriptions. There were almost 200 inscriptions on vases, of which just under 30, 29, were actually early alphabetic Greek. So it's one of the largest corpora of early alphabetic Greek that we have. There are also Phoenician amphoras. These are 2 that come from 2 of 5 that were found in the Iboion that date to the late 8th or early 7th century. And I also show this 4th century BC Phoenician amphora here that was actually found in the destruction deposit of 354 in the Agora of Methone. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the inscriptions, but one of the exciting things about this is that as I will come to in a moment, Methone becomes in the 8th century an apikia, a colony of Eretria. And the similarity of the Methonian vowels and the Eretrian vowels to the Phrygian vowels is incredible. And a lot of philologists have argued that this could not have happened independently, that either the Greeks influenced the Phrygians or the Phrygians the Greeks. What's interesting, of course, is that the original home of the Phrygians, and this is preserved in Herodotus, when they were still called the Vryges, and before they migrated to Anatolia, lived exactly in this area, in northern Pieria, extending further north into Macedonia, and then sometime in the course of the early Iron Age, migrated to Anatolia. So what it all means, to cut to the chase, as it were, is that the place where the Phoenician and Greek letters coalesced, where the Greeks were actually able to adopt and adapt the Phoenician alphabet, is a place that actually also requires the Phrygians. Poof goes Pithecusae, poof goes the Nile Delta, poof goes North Syria, and the Aegean all of a sudden becomes the place where these alphabets may well have coalesced, a place like Methone or its metropolis, Eretria. So the East Hill, I just show you a selection of pots. This is Final Neolithic. This is Euboean or locally made Euboean pot of the late 8th century, and an early red figure vase by the Bond painter that had been set up in the Stoa building, probably sometime in the later 6th or earlier 5th century BC, but was found in the destruction deposit of 354. And Manthos Besios actually believed that it may well have been hung up as a sort of picture on the wall, as it were. It's also on the West Hill where we excavated this incredible 6th century, an earlier destruction that dates basically to the middle of the Archaic period. And this was a fire over the entire West Hill. It does not seem to have been associated with any act of warfare or violence. It could have just been an industrial or domestic fire on the West Hill. But you see the remnants of this. Here you see it, I think, a little more clearly, the burnt various floor levels of the early buildings that we have. The amount of wonderful archaic pottery that was found was stunning. This is a piece by it's a Corinthian plate by the Lion painter. The main fragment was found by Manthos Besios, and we managed to find in 2014 adjoining fragments from this in various deposits on the West Hill. There's a lot of spectacular Corinthian. Here's a detail of a Corinthian crater. Also a lot of East Greek pottery, and the amount of East Greek pottery, both fine wares and also trade amphoras from Mytilene, from Chios, from Samos, from Asia Minor, is just truly spectacular. This is actually one of the largest Ionian cups I've ever seen. I think it's probably the largest one I know of in captivity. There's a lot of other East Greek, including this Milesian bowl or fruit stand. And here is one of many Chian amphoras. And this is a side detail of the same Chian amphora. So had I known, or had I fully grasped how much material Manthos Besios and our colleagues had found, we would never have applied for a digging permit. But we had, and we were granted one of the 3 Synergasia permits of the American School back in 2014. And so in looking at what we were going to do, it was really a multi-pronged but circumscribed research strategy. Controlled excavations with a view of full retrieval protocols for all the organic materials. So a lot of water sieving and a lot of dry sieving. Also intensive pedestrian surface surveys. I also wanted to throw some geophysics into it, but also to do a series of geomorphological corings to determine the extent of the ancient city, and also to locate the harbor, the exact location of where the harbor was. And we also embarked on what was one of the earliest terrestrial LiDAR surveys of any ancient Greek city. So the intensive surface survey was directed by 2 UCLA graduate students, Miles Chakurta and Marianne Condor-Nicholas. They basically did most of their work in the first 4 weeks of the 2014 season, and then continued to go back and redo or to do some of the plots that they couldn't get access to in 2014, the following year. They covered an area of some 80 hectares, that's 800 stremata, of which 55 hectares were subject to intensive survey, surface collection. And so their field methods followed ones that have become generally adopted standards in Aegean archaeology. And they have a forthcoming article in the journal Hesperia on their survey. So here they are doing some of their walking. And this is the area that they covered. So here is the ancient city, Methone, and this is the area of Macedonian Methone, and they did all this area in between. And as you can see, if you look at the prehistoric remains, everything from late Neolithic through early Iron Age, it's largely concentrated in the classical city of Methone, but also in the area of Macedonian Methone. If we look at the Roman period, there's nothing in the classical city, and it's all in Macedonian Methone. And what we see here on the right-hand map is something that Yannis Chamilakis has been looking at in his own excavations in Neolithic Thessaly, that what we have, particularly in the later, but it begins earlier in the middle Neolithic, or perhaps even the early part of the Neolithic period, is a whole series of farming villages that are located very close to one another. So this would have been one Neolithic village down here, where the ancient city was later built on, and there would have been another one just a kilometer or so away, with each with just a few nuclear families. I was also fortunate enough to get this 1945 aerial photograph taken by the US and Greek Air Force. And so this showed us what the area of the Aliakmon Delta looked like in 1945. And between 1945 and 2012, Samantha Martin was actually able to map out 4 different shorelines. That is how changing, how dynamic this landscape really is. It really is a stunning landscape. Back in the first year that we were involved in 2012, before we began the excavations, we were just studying the surface and the topography and the finds from previous excavations. I actually hired 2 of the local fishermen to take us up the Aliakmon River. And here it is in August of 2012. This is the month, of course, where the Aliakmon is at its lowest. We went about 4 kilometers up the Aliakmon. I got bored, and I said to one of the fishermen, let's turn around. I'm hungry and I'm dying for a beer. So we turned around and went. We could have just kept going and going and going. So these rivers are really important. They were navigable rivers. It really gave access to the Mediterranean, but also to the entire Balkan Peninsula. And this is why the location of Methone was so important. There's another photograph of that boat ride up the Aliakmon. And this is the Aliakmon Gorge closer to Vergina. You cannot get to the headwaters of Epirus today because there are a series of dams. There are actually 4 dams built on the Aliakmon today, but in antiquity, you certainly could have easily done it. And there was a geomorphological survey and coring, and this was directed by Nancy Papadopoulos and Jonathan Turner of University College Dublin, together with Rena Veropolido, who was our malacologist who studied the seashells and the land snails. And it was really to determine the ancient core line. They cored to a depth of over 6 meters, where we got an entire Holocene sequence. And we actually discovered at a depth of just over 3 meters, a work piece of timber that was worked on both sides. There was a plank, could have been anything. It could have been part of a harbor installation. It could have been part of a boat. It could have been just a plank of wood. So I asked Jonathan and Nancy if they could just do another core about 1 to 2 meters away, which they did, and we got another one of these work timbers. We radiocarbon dated it, and it was late 9th, very early 8th century BC. So just where it should be. So here is the area that we actually, you see the transects and where we did the coring, and these are some of the photographs of the coring. And this is the entire Holocene sequence. I won't bore you with this, but it's, you know, we were actually able to get down to Paleosols to look at where the original harbor of the city was. Terrestrial LiDAR survey. And this was done by my good friend, Robert Kane. And I've asked Robert if he would return to Greece to do, I want him to do a LiDAR model that we want to make available free of charge of the Hephaestion, the best preserved temple in Greece. Rob was an adjunct professor at both UC Berkeley and UCLA, but his main job was at the United States Geological Survey. He conducted the survey, the LiDAR survey, and we're really talking about millions of individual X, Y, and Z measurements at a rate of over 12,000 points per second. It's truly remarkable technology. And here's Rob with one of our students doing the LiDAR survey. He was also always after little helix, or where he could get a little bit of purchase to get his LiDAR, terrestrial LiDAR equipment a little higher than the topography. So he used our soil dump. And here is a model. It'll come to life in a second. And this is not just a sort of average model that you can do now with, you know, just with a handheld iPhone or an Android. Here we're coming to the excavations of the East Hill. You see the excavations of the East Hill here, and then we're going up to the hill, to the West Hill. And if you look carefully, you see these are the 1 meter contours. So there is actually structure, topographical structure to this model that is detailed down to at least 5 centimeters. So it really is a level of accuracy that is virtually unbelievable. And we were actually able to make all of our topographic plans on the basis of this LiDAR model. And you could just about do anything you like to do with this model. Our controlled excavations were really targeted, a small section down in the south, adjacent to where our Greek colleagues had excavated in earlier years, and also a place to the far north to check the nature of deposits there. Low-level drone photography, and Hugh Thomas was largely responsible for this, both conventional and thermal. Hugh actually, I think, penned an article called "Some Like It Hot." I never quite warmed to that title, but let that pass. And on account of plowing in this area, and forgive me for my American spelling, but I normally give this to American audiences, there was very little classical material in situ on the surface. So Methone is one of those rare sites where you start digging and you're instantly into archaic and early Iron Age levels. And for an early Iron Age shirt nerd like me, you know, that's just great. It doesn't get any better than that. It's as good as ice cream. Straight into archaic levels. The uppermost of these levels were characterized by surfaces with various industrial activities. So we had pottery kilns being studied by Debbie Sneed, metalworking, gold, bronze, iron, and lead. No clear evidence as yet for silver, but this is all being studied by a Swiss scholar, Sam Verdun. Also glassworking that Despina Ignatiadou is working on, and bone and ivory from one of my graduate students. Debbie was one of our graduate students, and so was Adam, who did a number on the bone and ivory. And we had similar activity on both the East and the West Hills. And the question that was percolating in my mind during all this excavation of industrial debris was, where on earth was the domestic quarter? Where did the ancient Methanians actually live? But we'll come to that in the fullness of time. This was one of the three kilns that Debbie is working on. This is the one we dug. Two others were dug by our Greek colleagues. And here are various views of it. And it turns out to be a really remarkable kiln. Here's a drawing that was done by Annie Hooton and Tina Ross. And what's interesting about this kiln is that although it may originally have been a standard updraft kiln, in its final phase, it was not updraft. And it's one of the very few, if not the first, actually identified cross-draft kiln in the Aegean. There has been one claimed for Minoan Crete that was published by Aladus van der Mortel, but there is still doubt on whether that is actually a true cross-draft kiln. Here is one of these horizontal flues. They're not vertical, and you can see another one of these flues here, very clearly horizontal. So it's not an updraft kiln, it's a cross-draft kiln, and Debbie's been speculating that it could have been for eggshell ware, this very specific, very thin-walled archaic pottery that's produced up in the North Aegean. The jury's out on what it was producing. We don't have any wasters, any telltale smoking gun to tell us what it was, but it's a very interesting kiln. Here are the two other kilns that were excavated by our Eforia colleagues in earlier years, and these are more standard updraft Greek kilns. And so what they're producing, what many of these kilns were producing, is locally produced copies of Euboean pottery. These are Euboean potters from Eretria, and the traditional date for the founding of the colony is 733 BC, 733 or 734. There's no clear evidence of when this happens, but it has to be, because of the nature of the finds, sometime in the later 8th century BC. The crater here is perhaps Euboean, an import, but these are both locally made Euboean products. There's also a lot of copper working, iron smithing, ivory and bone production, and also glass production. Some bronze crucibles that are being studied by Sam Verdun, and a whole slew of stone molds. We have about 25 of these, and some of these are being studied by Stiliana Galiniki of the museum in Thessaloniki. And a local jeweler in Thessaloniki, Nikos Xanthopoulos, has actually made replicas of jewelry from 3 of these many molds. So here is one of these molds that you see here. The pins, incidentally, that you see here and here are actually solid tin. I mean, why did they use such a, expensive metal? I don't know, but they had it around. Here's a drawing of that mold, and microscopic photography showed that there were actually inscriptions on this. You can clearly see this alpha. So you can see from the scale where we're dealing with an inscription that is, 4 millimeters wide. Here is some of the replica jewelry produced. Here is another one of these molds. This is triangular in shape, and all of its sides were used to cast gold or bronze work. Here's a drawing of this particular mold. And here is some of the jewelry that Nikos Xanthopoulos was actually able. In addition to these 25 or so stone molds, we literally had hundreds, if not thousands, of fragments of lost wax clay molds. This one that Sam Verdun has isolated, Sam believes was actually used to produce this bronze pendant, which is in the Ashmolean Museum. And we actually found one of these pendants, what the Germans used to call bottle stoppers, Macedonian bottle stoppers. We actually found one of these in the excavations on the West Hill. So a very exciting find. And just one final stone mold you see here, drawing of it, and the bronze pins that were made from this mold. Also, a lot of gold crucible melting pans and bellows nozzles or tuyères. Here's one of the bellows nozzles. Here's some more. And here are some of the gold melting pots. And if you look at what glitters, see all these little specks of gold? Well, it's gold. It's gold dust. And if you don't believe me, here's a little pellet of gold right there. I know where it is. And here's a detail of it. And the end product of this gold production was something that's also well known in the mother city of the colony at Eretria. This is an ingot of gold from Methone, and this is another ingot of gold from Eretria. This one, Methone, had actually been cut into 2 smaller pieces. A lot of bone and ivory. And one of the most exciting things is that, look at this. This is debitage. This is waste from elephant and a few hippo teeth. So it's elephant tusks and hippo tusks. And this is clear evidence of the working of elephant and hippopotamus ivory at Methone in the later 8th and 7th century BC. Here are some of the things, but the most spectacular find was this ivory seal of the late geometric period. This variegation that you see in the ivory is very standard for elephant tusk ivory. Here's a pressing into plaster. This is a side view of this ivory seal, and Tina Ross's wonderful drawing of it. Also faience seals, and we have a lot of faience in terms of scarabs, small containers, and jewelry. A lot of glass, and there's clear evidence of glass working, including these fragments of glass rods. When Despina Ignatiadou started working on the glass, she called me in a state of, like, she was panicked. She said, "John, you've got to tell me, there has to be Roman, disruption here." And I said, "What do you mean Roman disruption? There's nothing Roman at ancient Methone." She said, "But there's no rods in glass for the Roman period." Well, I said, "Why don't you come to Methone and we'll sit down with the trench notebooks and Manthos Besios and the database, and we'll go through the stratigraphy," which we did. and she went into a state of shock. These are archaic rods of glass. They're the earliest rods that we have in captivity. So just going back to the glass, a lot of the glass is actually wasted. So there's clear evidence for the production. Many of the beads were actually partial, so they were destroyed beads in production. So underneath these archaic and late geometric industrial levels, we started getting a whole early Iron Age sequence of buildings with these post holes. And what this is very important. This is very important and very clear evidence that what the Eretrian colonists settled in was not an empty, pristine landscape, but a viable and thriving community that goes back to the late Neolithic period and continues all the way through the early Iron Age. So they didn't settle a pristine landscape. It was already an important prehistoric center. So here is one of the trenches with the post holes, and these are rubbish pits with Mike Rocchio taking some photographs. And here you see this archaic kiln, some Mycenaean tombs that I'll come to in a minute, and a series of post holes. Here are the post holes. And what you can clearly see is an apsidal building. And to go right back in time, Mycenaean tombs. And here are some of them. These are late Bronze Age. And we also have some early and middle Bronze Age tombs in addition. So here is some the local Mycenaean pottery, amber in the top row and carnelian below, beads from these Mycenaean tombs. These are the finds from just one of these Mycenaean tombs, tomb 10. You can see gold and bone pins, amber, carnelian, more gold, more amber, and a series of pots and spindle whorled beads or buttons. Here are some of the pottery. Our bioarchaeologist is Sevi Triandafilo from the University of Thessaloniki, and Brian Damiata did a whole series of radiocarbon dates on human bone collagen, and these date just where they should, everything from the 14th down to the 12th centuries BC. So continuity right through from the late Bronze Age into the early Iron Age, before Eretria ever got involved in the Thoni. Here are some of the Mycenaean bronzes. Here are some of the Mycenaean tombs in the process of being excavated. The two heroines that did it were Debbie Sneed and Marianne Condor-Nicholas. Here are some of the representative tombs that we dug. Many of them with ledgers, so they were in stone, they were in wooden coffins, but ledgers cut into stone, or else they had a wooden cover. And some more of the finds. In addition, there were these contracted early Bronze and Middle Bronze Age burials. Here's one. Here's another. And only one of these yielded any small finds. This cup that dates right to the transition from the later stages of the early Bronze Age into the Middle Bronze Age. And one of the last of the Mycenaean tombs that we managed to excavate with some of the finds. So this gives us an idea of this small area that we actually dug in the southern section. Here is the kiln, the Mycenaean tombs, and these industrial levels with post holes. more inscriptions of the archaic, early Iron Age, archaic and classical periods, particularly of the archaic and classical periods before and after firing, and some surprises. Boy, did I want this to be Phoenician. I showed it to every Phoenician expert I could find, to no avail. Nobody could read it. It's not Greek. And it looks like it's one of these Thracian indigenous languages. But as you can see, only 4 letters on a pot that's very clearly made in the 8th or 7th century BC. So it's a multilingual, it's a multi-societal place, a sort of place that brings in people from everywhere. But the real exciting discovery was the second one of these basements, these ipoia. And here is the kiln, right? Here are these archaic floor levels. What started off as a rubbish pit, the 4th century BC of the destruction deposit, turned into a bottomless, endless, deep pit. So you remember the first ipoion that was dug by our Greek colleagues? You see it here. Well, here's the second one. It's much smaller, much more circumscribed, almost square, not quite. The wretched thing just kept going and going and going. And Hugh and Brandon Braun, the 2 heroes that excavated it, actually thought that they had come to the end of the 4th century pit, but no, they kept digging and it never ended. And it literally never ended. Now here's Hugh. Now, how tall are you, Hugh? Like 6'2", 6'3"? Just to give you an idea of the scale. Near the lowest levels that were reached in 2016, a whole bunch of broken pots, including this Hedria, and this wonderful drawing by Annie Hooton. And it's a call out to our fabulous illustrators, Annie Hooton, Tina Ross, and Triada Kutuki. And it's filled with multiple deposits. And a shout out here to Trevor Van Dam and Mariana Nicolaidou, who were responsible for the pot shed, who just did yeoman's work and just sorting material. A lot of attic red figure pottery. Here is just a few of the fragmentary pots. Piece of Athenian black figure. There were also incised and stamped vessels. This is part of the rim of a luterion of late archaic date. And there's also a lot of residual earlier material. Here is a remarkable geometric bronze horse. This is actually the first freestanding bronze horse found in an established, non-disturbed context in the North Aegean. So the excavators, Brandon Braun and Hugh Thomas, the pottery done by Trevor Van Dam and Mariana Nicolaidou, they dug it to a depth of 10 meters where the bedrock was prone to collapse and started getting really dangerous and unsafe. So right at the very bottom, we got an auger and we got down to a depth with the auger of 12.15 meters. No end, no bedrock. It was marked by at least 12 steps cut into the northeast face, 14 in the adjacent southeast face, without ever reaching bedrocks. There were 2 levels of clear stratigraphic fill, the upper one that is part of the 4th century or maybe slightly earlier destruction of Methone. The lower one is part of this mid-6th century. And in the material at the lowest levels, Trevor and Mariana started seeing a change, but we just didn't get enough of it. There was a dramatic decrease in the number of pottery, in the quantity of pottery. So we never got to the earlier phase, but it's pre-mid 6th century BC. Hugh and Brandon estimated that it was 46 tons of dirt over 4 years from a rock cavity that was just under 40 cubic meters in volume. So here's a photogrammetric model that Hugh made. But why am I talking when the lads can tell us their own story? So here is part of a video. The sound will come on momentarily, featuring Brendan Braun and Hugh Thomas.
We think that the first several meters of this pit date to the end of the 4th century and probably to the destruction of Lithonia itself. Within it, we have a lot of red figure and highly black glazed pottery that dates the unit to about the end of the classical period. Below that, we're starting to get more and more archaic material, and we're thinking now that there must have been an earlier fill or stratified deposit down there. And as we continue going down, we're getting more archaic.
So we decided to place this large amount of shoring, over €600 worth of wood and metal poles, going down about 7 meters or so, in order to shore up the sections and stop any dirt or the sections collapsing in on top of us. But then the other issue we have is, how do we get the material that we're excavating out of the pit? So we've had this structure over here built, which allows us to lay a piece of wood across and set up a pulley system. So every ounce of dirt that we dig from the pit, we have to pull out in a Zambili.
So now at more than 9 meters deep, we're still in archaic fill, and we're not really sure how much further it'll go.
Famous last words, Brandon. This is what the poor guys had to do every morning and every...
So here we are at the bottom of the pit. We're over 9 meters below the surface of ancient Methone, and we've come down this ladder here, which is what we have to go down and go back up every day to get in and out. And what you might notice either side of me is a series of cut steps. We have at least a dozen on each side going all the way up to the top of the pit, most of them now covered by the shoring. And underneath this step, you can actually see an area of collapse, we think. One of the most interesting things about excavating this feature is the fill that's inside of it, because not only do we get sort of ceramics, but we also get things like shell, bone, structural clay. And this is all of the refuse, the rubbish that the ancient Methonians had, and probably threw in here to fill up this feature. So it gives us a really wonderful snapshot of what ancient Methone was like in this time period, at least the archaic, all the way through to the end of the classical period.
In the northern trenches, Hugh, you could have been a movie star, mate. In the northern trenches, it was Adam Di Battista and Angelos Falis, and these were two small test trenches that we dug, and here is a simplified Harris matrix showing that there were no Mycenaean tombs this far north on the promontory or on the hill, but a very clearly pre-Eretrian early Iron Age series of deposits all the way through into the 6th century BC. So Methone is arguably the largest and most important harbor of the North Aegean in this period. It functioned in antiquity, much like Thessaloniki does today. It's linked to a broader Mediterranean network. It's an industrial powerhouse attracting Neolithic, Bronze Age, Mycenaean traders and prospectors. Anybody who needed to make a buck could come to Methone to get richer. Later, Euboeans, Athenians, Phoenicians, and many others. It's a veritable middle ground, bringing resources from the rich interior of the Balkans through these rivers like the Ali Akmon and Axios, all the way to the Mediterranean, to the Aegean and to the Mediterranean beyond, in return for finished products of gold, bronze, lead, iron, glass, bone and ivory, pottery, etc. And that doesn't count the organic things like textiles, for which we have a lot of evidence. So what was the purpose of these ipogia? Well, I think it's to store all of this valuable material. Think about one pirate ship coming and taking all your gold, whether it's raw or finished products, and all of your ivory. So they hid it underneath buildings. And they used these steps, not as steps per se, but as a wooden structure for shelving for their goods. And they could actually climb up and down using these shelves. So the question remained, where was the settlement? Where did the average person in Methone live? And this was done by my great friend and colleague, Brian Damiata. And Brian, threw all sorts of different geophysical techniques to see what would work. Quick and dirty techniques like ground penetrating radar were no good, simply because of the clayey nature of the soil, which just was impenetrable. So we actually found that electromagnetics was the way to go, and it was the only system that actually worked for Methone. So a couple of early views of the geophysics, and we started picking up all sorts of features. We thought this was going to be a fortification wall. That's what I thought in my infinite wisdom. Boy, was I wrong. And I also thought, hey, Brian, this has to be the shoreline. Again, I was completely wrong. Here is a detailed view of the transects. And these are the cores that Jonathan and Nancy did for the geomorphological survey. And this is the final geophysics. The strips here is because Brian actually took his electromagnetic equipment between groves of olives. And that's what accounts for that. So this is what the area looked like. So we had to ground truth this, and we did in 2017. And I said to Brian, tell us where to put the trenches. So he looked at this map and he put the trenches here. We dug all of these trenches. And look at this. We got an entire gridded city. We've got a second Olinthos. And here it is. You can actually see some of the architecture exposed here and here, and you can actually see the cracks, the long walls in these test trenches. So that's something for the future, I hope, for some of our students or for archaeologists elsewhere. So we've got another Olinthos. I wanted to finish with local community support. It began with the ladies of near Agathopoulos, the closest village to ancient Methone, who would bring us up snacks. It was a very nice custom that got bigger and bigger and bigger every year. And here it is one year, and there's Hugh stuffing his face together with the rest of the team. And here are some of the team with the ladies of Nea Agathopoulos. So in 2015 and 16, Sarah and I decided, using our own money, putting our money where our mouths were, to renovate this old abandoned railway station. The old railway line was right on the coast. The new railway line is about 10 kilometers inland. So we started this renovation, and we had a 2016 summer opening, replete with the local priest. And I also got Nikos Sementzidis, the local artist, to paint new, if you allow me to translate, cultural superstation, ancient Methoni, near Archaeology. You know, not even Manhattan has a cultural superstation. So, decided to do a number on this local artist who just went around painting whatever abandoned derelict building or wall he could find. Nikos Sementzidis is his name. He's not only a painter, but he's also a poet. And here is some of his work. Jeff Vanderpool, I have photographed it all, and we're planning a book, an exhibit of his artwork. There's a few interiors, but it's mainly exteriors. This is Nikos's own home. And he also started doing the seafront. There he is at work. And the seafront at Methoni Beach. Changing room. Another angle of the changing room. And a self-portrait on one of the rocks. He also would find little rocks and paint them up as little baby seals. And he also painted the local bird tower, wherever he could find a marble block. And here was a sign that said, you know, ancient Methoni, dangerous, beware, be careful, do not enter. And Nikos snuck up one evening and painted on the back of this sign following, which again, if you allow me to translate, no experience in life can perhaps be compared with the following: to meet an ancient Macedonian. So here he is in his home playing his guitar, and I have a dream. Just like every archaeologist that ever worked at this site, we all had the same dream. What is ironic is that here are our excavations on the West Hill, and this is the only public land on the entire site. It's a small area, and this is why we were able to dig here, and why our colleagues were able to dig here. The rest, ironically, all of this area beyond, which is marshland, is still brought down by these rivers, is actually protected as part of the Natura Vita program of the European Union. So the wetlands and the habitat for thousands of birds. The first year I arrived there in 2011, there was a flock of like almost 50 flamingos nesting here. This is protected, whereas the archaeological site is still in private hands. So the dream is to expropriate all the land and to make it a visitable site. So with this video running, that's all I have to offer. Thank you for your attention and for sticking to the bitter end with me.
Well, very, very many thanks, John. That was a truly awesome presentation on an equally awesome site. And indeed, I'll overuse the word again, on an equally awesome project, a very multifaceted project. And we are all in your debt for presenting it to us. And I'm sure there's so much more that you could have said. And I suspect that much will come out in questions which members of the audience would like to ask. So if you have a question, could I please ask you to put it into the chat, and I'll relay it to our speaker. If I could start with one, of course, there are many amazing aspects to the site, but truly the craftsmanship and the industrial nature of the settlement is just out there. And one question which came to my mind immediately was, has the source of the stone in which the molds for the jewelry are made of, has that been located, or has the stone been identified?
Yes, Yannis Manos studied the stone tools, and Yannis Vlastridis, 2 Johns, 45 Γιάννηδες, ενός χώρου γνώσης. 2 Johns actually did a number on the stone. The molds are coming from all over the place. None of those stones are local.
Yeah,
hey,
I mean, that's what I was suspecting and wanted to hear. Okay, so that's very, very interesting. I see that Susan has her hand up, so maybe you'd like to ask your question directly, Susan.
If you don't mind. First off, I just want to say hi, John.
Hey, Susan, good to see you after so much time.
I know,
so much water under the bridge.
Yeah. Oh, look where I am.
I know, my old stomping grounds.
I know. So yes, I had a couple questions, of course. One is a Bronze Age question. One is a colonial question. Because what you were talking about really intrigued me, that there was a society, a community there before the Eritreans got there. Do you see evidence that there was immediately before? Like, were they interacting with people when they got there? And
yes,
any sense of how that might have gone?
Yes, there's some very interesting imports. There is, for example, a cemetery that's associated with ancient Methone that's actually not far from the area of Macedonian Methone. And there's a solitary tomb that was excavated there with a Euboean late protogeometric pot. So there was interaction. But at the same time, exactly at the same time, and also as down into the middle geometric period, we're getting Athenian imports. So people are coming from all over the place. So there are, there are pots from Euboea, pots from Athens, and then once we get down into the 8th century, they're coming from all over the universe. Okay, so everybody's nuzzling here, for some action. The Phoenicians are there, the Euboeans are there, the Athenians are there. We have really 2 wonderful examples of Thapsos ware that I just didn't have time to show you. So yeah, there's a lot of evidence, I think, for interacting. And as I said before, a little bit tongue in cheek, but, I meant what I said. Anybody that wanted to make a buck, whether it was in the 12th century or the 10th century or the 8th century or the 6th century, would come here. It was a veritable middle ground.
I was just curious if also there might have been some antagonism between the people who were there originally, but maybe they were sort of open to having a colony, like they thought, oh, this is, going to be for their benefit.
Well, interpersonal violence is one of the things that we can't see very clearly in the record. I mean, what we do have are the destruction deposits. We clearly see the destruction deposit of 354 BC. Whether the mid-6th century BC destruction was one that was produced by interpersonal violence, we just don't know.
Right. Interesting. Okay, can I ask my second question?
Of course.
Yes. The second question is a Bronze Age one. So you're talking about Bronze Age burials and things like that, but have you found any cult material?
No.
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 Okay.
No, sadly. And what's very clear from those late Neolithic and early Bronze Age ditches on the East Hill, that the settlement was not on the West Hill. The settlement, the prehistoric settlement, was on the East Hill. Manthos Besios tried, and I actually, with him, tried to resuscitate this project. He dug a big, narrow trench on the East Hill, got down to undisturbed protogeometric, early protogeometric levels, and then it got dangerous to go any deeper. And we just didn't want to kill people. But that's where the Mycenaean settlement would be, and any cult activity. Right. So what that would take is actually a lot more digging and a much larger trench.
A lot broader. Yeah. Okay.
I see a lot of old friends. Hey, Teddles, Leah and Tom, and Helen Nicholson. Boy, it's, you know.
Hi, John.
Hey, mate.
Okay, we have a question from, I mean, there are many thanks in the chat, John, all expressing the view that you gave a terrific and wonderful talk. There is a question from Madeline Bowers. Wonderful talk. Thank you, John. You mentioned having evidence of textiles. Do you have any surviving textiles, or is it mostly tools?
It's mostly the tools. And one of the big aspects, and it's actually the chapter that Sarah has published, is actually all the tools associated with spinning and weaving that were found actually in the first Ipoion. So there's a lot of evidence, but, you know, Greece is, you know, unless you have an anaerobic context, Greece is terrible for the protection and survival of textiles and organic materials. So sadly, no. I also think we have peripheral evidence for leatherworking. What's interesting is that a lot of the metalworking is done by stone tools, and that's very clear. And that's actually one of the important contributions I think that Mathoni will make with this forthcoming volume. Well,
I'm sure that we're all very, very much looking forward to reading the volume. So make sure that your library orders it. Yeah, I'll put that plug in because without having seen it, I'm sure that it's very much worth having. As time's passing, I'd just like to thank John again